Hey there everyone, so good to see you. Daniel here with something just a little bit different. I wanted to do a video with the usual silly / informational format about Fire Emblem, specifically the Blazing Blade since it just came out on NSO, but I'm just busy. I won't be able to do a properly edited video, but boy do I at least want to talk about it because I think it's a very important title. So this will be a bit more conversational than usual. If you like this format, let me know afterwards and maybe I'll do more like this in the future, who knows. But onto the game itself. Fire Emblem is a series with a weird and unusual history. We're at the point where if you ask somebody what their first title was, they'll likely answer with a game on the Switch or the 3DS. But for some of us, the series started with the 7th title, simply named Fire Emblem. How did that happen? Well, there's quite a lot of people who were introduced to the series without actually ever playing any of the titles. In Japan, Fire Emblem enjoyed being a healthy franchise from Marth's introduction with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light to the Super Famicom titles Genealogy of the Holy War and Thracia 776. It wasn't until Super Smash Bros. Melee that players overseas like us would get a taste of this foreign tactical turn-based RPG. Marth had been planned for the original Smash Bros. On the N64 but didn't quite make the cut. Roy, on the other hand, he didn't even have his game, The Binding Blade, released yet. Being Nintendo's greatest advertisement in history, Smash Bros. Used Roy to promote the newest upcoming game to Japanese fans who were eagerly awaiting the first Fire Emblem title that would come to the Game Boy Advance. Funny that they would use this tactic with Roy, and then again with Corrin before we could play Fire Emblem Fates. We weren't even initially supposed to get these characters overseas. After some internal decisions, we got both Marth and Roy, who at the time were just two guys that used swords, didn't speak English, and had an awesome battle theme. It didn't take long for players overseas to get an interest in exactly who these two were. Despite most titles featuring new cast of characters, similar to Final Fantasy, Marth was and still is the main face of Fire Emblem, even all these years later. Roy, however, was the most recent protagonist in the 6th installment in the series. But due to the fact that the next Fire Emblem was already in development, rather than translate and localize his game, Nintendo would make plans to present the series to Western audiences for the first time. This decision was further boosted by how well Advance Wars was performing a couple years prior. Thanks to the grace of Nintendo power, I was very quickly drawn to the designs and style of this game. I'll never forget looking at the promotional art and thinking, Roy looks kinda different, and why is Marth so buff? After wisening up, I learned that this Fire Emblem doesn't take place in the same world as Marth, and is actually a prequel to Roy's game, where one of the main characters is his father, Eliwood. He is joined by his best friend and fellow noble, Hector, as well as Lyn, a girl from the plains who introduces you to the game. Although it's simply called Fire Emblem, the series has reached a point in popularity that is now known and recognized by its full title, Fire Emblem: The Blazing Blade. If you haven't played Fire Emblem before, if 3 houses or Engage looked a bit too daunting to dive into, then you may want to consider giving this game a chance. Aside from Fire Emblem Awakening, I think Blazing Blade is one of the best games to introduce new players to the core basics of the series. Compared to the aforementioned titles, it's much more stripped down and simple, but in a good way. Fire Emblem presents itself through chapters, each one challenging you to a battle on a grid-based map, bookended by story both before and after said battle, all doing their part to drive the narrative forward. Fights typically consist of 2 factions, your blue allied units and the enemy red units. Sometimes there are also green units, who are on your side but are not directly controllable. Battles always begin on your turn, and you have to order every single character to do a task before your enemy acts. If you're close enough to an enemy, you can attack. If not, you can prep your character by equipping the correct weapon, healing a unit. If you're adjacent to an ally, you can trade items or sometimes talk to them. You can wait in an advantageous spot, visit a house, or even break a part of the environment. No matter who your unit is, you can usually make progress even if you aren't necessarily attacking that turn. Unless you're like too busy admiring the sprite art of this game. Look at it! It's so good! The background textures, the map itself, the character portraits, the little chibi character portraits, and oh my goodness, the battle sprites. Some of the nicest sprite work that the Game Boy Advance ever did see. It didn't do any crazy stretching and zooming like Golden Sun, for example, but man, they are some of the cleanest animations and colorful sprites made. Enjoy the critical hits of this game in particular. They get more and more ridiculous the further in the game you get. Fire Emblem has not been the same since Game Boy Advance crit hit animations. And you'll be getting plenty of opportunities to see them when you choose to attack. Before battle, you're given a list of parameters and stats to consider in a handy forecast. There are a whole bunch of stats and numbers that are given to you if you look up each individual unit. You can calculate so much on your own if you wanted, from hit percentage, critical hit rate, dodge percentage, if your unit will attack twice, weapon weight that affects your attack speed in conjunction with your unit's constitution, or weight. It's a lot. But thankfully the game breaks down the most important info that you need when preparing to engage with an enemy. If you have played other Fire Emblem games, chances are you're familiar with the weapon triangle, the rock, paper, scissors of this franchise. When battling, keep in mind what weapon you and your enemy have equipped. You'll have a slight advantage in connecting, dodging, and damage output if you choose a weapon with the upper hand. Later in the game, you'll encounter a similar trinity with the magic spells, but that's once you get a grasp on the physical weapons first. Your goal will most often be to seize a throne or eliminate all enemies, but you might also get different objectives, like protecting an allied green unit for a set amount of turns or defending a specific point. They will vary, but if you tactfully distribute experience amongst your army, there won't be a single encounter that you can't handle. Some units, despite having the same classes, will have different growth rates when leveling up. One cavalier might lean towards having more strength and defense, while another might grow more quickly with speed and can attack twice against more enemies. Watching your favorite units grow, eventually classing them up and seeing them wreck everyone in the battle, it's one of the most satisfying aspects of Fire Emblem. Most units can become very good, you just gotta put some love and care into them throughout the story. There are 2 story arcs to the Blazing Blade. The first 10 chapters follow Lyn in a story that's constructed to help guide players who may be new to the Fire Emblem series. Most of these chapters will present a new gameplay element before letting you proceed on your own. It's kind of also very handholdy, especially for those who are veterans now, sometimes to an egregious degree. But it's also useful for beginners, and the game eventually becomes completely hands-off in time. For the sake of keeping it short with no spoilers, Lyn finds herself in a situation where she learns that one of her only living family members' lives is in danger due to a power feud. She gathers allies and races to a new land that she might call home after growing up on the plains her whole life. Fire Emblem loves to do time skips between their own games or between sequels, but the Blazing Blade keeps it fairly simple. Part 1 has a relatively minor jump at the end of Lyn's arc, which leads into the beginning of the main story. Part 2 mainly follows Eliwood, a young noble of Foray, as he goes on a journey to find his missing father. Not long after starting, he is joined by Hector, a fellow noble and old childhood training buddy, classmate, you know how it goes. Eventually, Lyn also rejoins, and the three form the core team of lords that go on a journey across the continent of Lebe. As far as main characters go, I really have a soft spot for this trio. Eliwood is more of your typical do-good protagonist who isn't too different from a character like Marth, which isn't a bad thing, mind you. I like Eliwood as a character, but he is often the most forgotten one. Hector, on the other hand, is rougher around the edges. He can be brash, he can be cocky, but he can also be very down-to-earth and casual despite being the brother to a lord. Both Hector and Lyn can be fairly blunt at times, especially with each other. Lyn did not grow up as a noble, and her sassy attitude can lead to her butting heads with others. She and Hector form a sort of rivalry, most notable in their support conversations. But they all have good hearts, and they make a fun dynamic throughout the story. And as far as what I remember, I think the writing and translation are pretty good given the era that it came from. For those who might have found the story of Fire Emblem Engage to be a little too over the top for their taste, I believe you'll enjoy how this game is much more grounded. It might over-explain in some cases, but there's a strong and genuinely interesting story entwined here, taking itself more seriously at times than you might expect. It revolves around themes of family and belonging, to themes of manipulation, isolation, loss, preying on people's greed and wants, and the political dismantlement that can arise from it. The main enemy organization, the Black Fang, comprises of one of the most interesting groups of villains in Fire Emblem, especially once you make it about halfway through the game. And that story is conveyed in writing and a localization that has aged surprisingly well. Despite the limitations that come from being on a handheld, the Blazing Blade delivers a story bigger than itself. It might be the 7th game in the series, but it is classic Fire Emblem. Just please set the text faster in the options as soon as you can. The normal speed is just obscenely slow. Speaking of the narrative, there are chapters where, if certain conditions are met, you might be playing a different version of said chapter from one playthrough to the next. This is one of the ways that developers encourage repeated runs. It's not a terribly long game. In the Japanese release, you can link to the Binding Blade if you have a copy, and have the option to completely skip Lyn's tutorial among having access to other features. Cool extra tidbit, you can perform this bonus feature with an NSO very easily, and that's just awesome. Sure wish that we could do that with the English version. If there only was one. Anyways, this meant that all international releases must do Lyn's story at least once before having the option to start a new file with part 2. But why would you skip it? It's Lyn. You can also choose to have Hector be the main focus. The story does still largely follow Eliwood's journey, but this gives you new perspectives, different cutscenes, and an extra few chapters that are exclusive to Hector's story. It really helps show off how much of a hot-blooded youth he is. Guy just wants to help his friend, very casually kills a man in front of him, and he's just like, "Yeah, sorry, I'm in a hurry." And the rest of the party is like, "Good lord." He is simply one of the best lords in Fire Emblem. His campaign is also harder. Playing Elowood's story on hard difficulty is almost the equivalent of Hector's on normal, and Hector hard mode is basically the lunatic difficulty of this title. But even so, it's still relatively easy compared to other titles that would come down the line, and arguably the ones before it. And I think that's a good thing. As I mentioned, this game is very friendly for newcomers, as the entire first arc of the story serves as a tutorial with Lyn to guide you. That's part of the reason why you can skip it entirely when you begin a new file. And I do specifically mean that she guides you. Because in this game, you take on the role of a tactician that she found passed out somewhere. If you played Fire Emblem Awakening, this probably sounds very familiar to you. But the difference here is that the tactician doesn't make a huge impact on the story the same way that Robin does. Before you begin, you can name your tactician, give your birth month, gender, and if you happen to be playing the Japanese version, your blood type. I believe this was more of a cultural thing and was removed for our versions. You have your own sprite, but you yourself are not a playable unit and instead are there for context, as you're the one who directs the army within the universe of the game. I've heard mixed reactions about this approach, that it's kind of pointless to have the tactician there for some, or that it made others really feel like they're involved with the overarching plot. As for me, I definitely fall in the latter category. To go slightly off tangent, I quite enjoyed inserting myself into the story of the game. It was unlike anything I ever experienced at the time. The character portraits, the three main lords particularly, would turn and talk to me, address me, and ask me questions. You never had any agency on how you would respond to them, but it still made it feel like you were a person to them. I think that's really all it needs to do. I don't have to be super intimately involved with the main plot or marry someone, you know? Nearly every unit at some point or another would speak to you directly, and it helped give some insight into their characters who otherwise wouldn't get very much screen time. Sometimes it would feel more personal, like a lord asking you where you're from and that they want to hear your story. And I think it's the imagination that it evoked. That self-insertion to the world that makes this Fire Emblem feel different from any other. I wish the tactician would be incorporated in this way more, to give it that personal flavor which made you feel more involved. I was kind of disappointed that the games which followed, Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance, didn't take this approach. It's pretty cool to be recognized as the person who is contextually micromanaging everything, from equipment to strategy, and having characters say that they trust you to get your army to meet their goals. It also makes you feel way more responsible, and any units lost feel that much more personal, more so than any other game. As such, don't be afraid to use a tool that we didn't have back in the day. This was before the era of casual mode, so there is no shame in putting a suspend point before a dicey encounter. Just think of it as a modern Divine Pulse. That's just strategy. I'm pretty sure that the avatar character has taken over how perspective will be handled in Fire Emblem from here onward, but I'll always miss this angle. There are some aspects of this game that haven't aged well, or some that people might find unusual. There's no button to show your enemy's move and attack range, so you just gotta tap each enemy and commit it to memory. Aside from arenas, there are no chances for extra skirmishes to help level up your characters. Unlike modern titles, there are, however, certain chapters where if you meet certain conditions on the map, you'll be given a chance to do an optional side chapter. These serve to expand the story, recruit new allies, and give your characters more experience. But other than that, there is largely a finite amount of experience that you can earn in this game. Support conversations were also, let's say, still being figured out in this era. Instead of fighting adjacent to compatible allies, you earn support points by waiting entire turns next to a unit until they are ready to advance their rank, and then have them talk to each other. But this can take many turns, especially for some A ranks. There are no S ranks, and you can only have 5 support conversations per unit. So you can only A rank one pair and have them go as high as B rank for another character, optimally. If you want to know exactly what bonuses you get from supporting, that all comes down to character affinity and overall rank, which, it can get pretty involved. Might I suggest looking this up on Sereness Forest. This is also from the era of limited weapon durability, which I know has even more of a stigma in this day and age following some titles, but I swear it's not that bad. Don't fall for the too awesome to use trap. If you've got good weapons, use them. Let them break. I invite it. I was molded by the fear of weapons breaking in the heat of battle. You just get used to it. One niche complaint that I personally have since this is on NSO is that there's no way to get the DLC items. And you might think, wait, DLC on a Game Boy Advance game? Yeah, you can get extra items with the help of Mario Kart Double Dash. By using this, you can hook up your GBA and transfer items right to your cartridge. This is the weirdest thing. They have a UI and text box made specifically for this tiny sequence and a remixed version of the intro music. This figure, Saint Elamine, who you don't even ever see in the Blazing Blade, grants you this gift. She was more often referenced in Roy's game, so it's a pretty surreal experience. Once the transfer is over, there's a new option on the main screen under Extras. You can transfer a bunch of items to your file. It's a lot more convenient once you add Merlinus' convoy to your party though. You get a set of stat boosting items, the Emblem set, which is pretty much iron weapons with increased durability, and exclusive weapons and items that you usually cannot get elsewhere. You can get a silver card to discount items to half price at any shop. The Emblem seal is unique to this transfer and increases a unit's accuracy and avoid by 10 points. The Dragon Axe is effective against wyverns, and you get a rare ranged sword, the Wind Sword. They're not by any means necessary and just meant to give you a little boost, but they're fun to have. I'm not actually sure what the purpose of explaining that was when we can't even get them on NSO. Please just let me have it, Nintendo. I say that, but we likely won't get it. Just like we won't get Roy's game, The Binding Blade, translated for the English-speaking NSO, right? It's right there, man. This is essentially the sequel to The Blazing Blade, taking place many years later and follows the boy Roy, son of Eliwood, who has grown into his own as a leader. He is accompanied by Lelina, daughter of Hector, who now has just the most powerful beard and mustache in all of Fire Emblem. It really is a shame. The Fire Emblem games that came before Blazing Blade that we can officially enjoy in English are Shadow Dragon, Echoes, and that's it. Only the first two games. Shadow Dragon was released for the DS in a weird time for Fire Emblem when the series was starting to lose its edge overseas. It didn't sell well enough to justify localizing the much better sequel, New Mystery of the Emblem. That one's always gonna sting. And as of the making of this video, Genealogy of the Holy War and Thracia 776 are nowhere to be found. I just want this to happen. But we just got a new Fire Emblem game like half a year ago, so I'm not exactly dying for a new entry anytime soon. And now we have another game to play while we wait. It's nice to be reunited with old friends. So what about you? Will this be the first time you'll be playing Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade? Did you also get introduced to Fire Emblem through Smash Bros? Is Lyn still best girl? The answer is yes. Let us know down in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. It's nice to just ramble like this. If you want more varied content like this, be sure to subscribe to Good Vibes Gaming, leave a like, ring the bell for notifications, catch me and Brandon on Twitch. And just for $1 on Patreon, you can join our merry band of tacticians on our own Discord. Please consider it. If you don't, I'm gonna be forced to crit hit you with good vibes. This is absolutely a threat. I'll do it. Don't test me. Thanks again for checking this out. Till we meet again.